Nick stepped into this game not with the composure of a man negotiating, but with the sensation of tightening a noose around his own throat and choosing to pull anyway. He knew he couldn't approach Jack openly, because one careless rumor would be enough to turn everything into evidence against him, enough to force his family and his company into permanent defense. Yet that very secrecy made Nick's choice even more dangerous. A clandestine meeting is always the mark of either desperation or calculation. And Nick was both desperate and calculating. He carried an unhealed wound inside him. What Matt had done didn't amount to damage that could be measured only in money or stock value. But the feeling of having control snapped in half, of being dragged through a private humiliation he refused to let anyone witness. Nick didn't want a resolution, he wanted revenge. He wanted Matt to taste pain in the exact shape of the pain he had inflicted, to suffer for the consequences that had ripped away Nick's sense of safety and his faith in the order he once relied on to survive. That was why the meeting with Jack felt like an agreement with two faces. On the surface, it was a proposal that sounded rational: recruit Matt, keep him close, extract the information and leverage he carried like a special asset in the ongoing war between powerful forces. But the deeper layer was what Nick truly wanted: to turn Matt into a man who could be steered. A man forced to bow to the very people he once destabilized. Nick didn't have to say it out loud, and he didn't need to, because Jack was sharp enough to read it in the tightly controlled breath, in the silences that ran a fraction too long, in the way Nick selected details about his secret deal as if he were placing a blade on the table, without drawing it from its sheath. Jack understood that Nick hadn't come to ask permission. He had come to find an ally who could help transform Matt from threat to instrument, and also to distribute the moral weight, because the burden of crossing lines is always heavier when a man crosses them alone. Jack didn't rush to agree or allow himself to be swept up in Nick's anger. His caution wasn't fear. It was recognition of how people like Matt behaved. The more they're cornered, the harder they lash out and the more unpredictable they become. Jack saw Matt as a true double-edged knife, on edge capable of slicing an enemy open, the other edge ready to cut the hand that holds it. What made Jack most wary wasn't the obvious danger, but the sense that Matt knew his own value, knew he could force other people into compromise. A man aware of his value is never easy to reduce to a pawn. He will always try to remake the board into a place where he gets to set conditions. Even so, Nick and Jack arrived at the same conclusion, not because they trusted each other absolutely, but because they understood the pressure of the moment and the brutal necessity of choosing the least disastrous option. Leaving Matt outside their reach was more dangerous than pulling him close, because a man outside could strike from any direction, while a man kept near at least reveals his breathing, his footsteps, and the smallest tells of deceit. They decided they wouldn't merely take information from Matt, they would manipulate him, push him into actions that served both Newman and Jabbit. It was the first slide toward an ethical boundary they kept telling themselves they still controlled. They were no longer simply defending, they were actively using a human being as a tool. The terrifying part was that once they stepped over that line, every step after would feel easier, more reasonable, and more ruthless. Nick began to pull Matt's strings with the language Matt couldn't resist: advantage, and the intoxicating feeling of being needed. Nick understood that to manipulate a dangerous man, you couldn't lead with blunt threats. You had to give him the illusion that he was choosing his own path, proving his worth, becoming indispensable. Nick nudged Matt into strategic moves meant to strengthen Newman's position in the market, but each move was wrapped in the logic of necessary circumstances, so Matt wouldn't see the hand guiding him. In a way, Nick was steering and gambling at the same time. He needed Matt to do things that, if successful, would benefit Newman, and if they failed, would leave Matt standing where the fallout landed first. Yet at the same time, Nick felt something cold and sharp scraping at his own sense of self-respect. He began to wonder how he was different from Matt if he was willing to push someone else into danger, in exchange for the feeling that his power had been restored. The question didn't stop him, it only made every next decision heavier, darker, and more personal. Jack, in his own way, began shaping Matt as well, more quietly, more elegantly, and therefore more dangerously. Jack directed Matt towards serving Jabbit's interests in the brutal competition. But he didn't do it with direct pressure. He created pathways that made Matt believe he had discovered an opportunity to prove himself, to correct course, to become a figure no one could ignore. Jack knew Matt needed a story to tell himself, that he wasn't bought, not led by the nose, but choosing the best side for himself. Jack exploited that need by placing in Matt's hands assignments that were risky enough to thrill him, attractive enough to hook him, and binding enough that Matt couldn't back out without losing face. Jack wasn't trying to make Matt loyal. He only needed Matt trapped in a chain of actions Matt believed he had initiated, so that every step forward pulled him farther away from any safe exit. But a double-edged knife never cuts in a clean line the way the holder expects. Matt created chaos in ways no one calculated thoroughly. Moves Nick and Jack believed they could control brushed against sensitive weaknesses, triggering chain reactions that forced them to respond with speed and desperation. And the more they reacted, the more they revealed that something was being hidden. When people try too quickly to smother a fire, they often expose the very thing they're terrified the flames will reach. Nick felt his heartbeat shift every time another unforeseen consequence surfaced. He started living in constant alertness, as if any call could be the signal that Matt had turned, that everything they built was trembling one breath away from collapse. The deeper the manipulation grew, the dirtier it felt inside both Nick and Jack. They had to keep rationalizing they were doing this to protect the company, to protect their families, because there was no other choice. But those reasons weren't enough to erase the simple truth that they were using a person as a tool. Nick, who had once believed he understood the line between right and wrong, began to see that the line was never clear at all. It was a foggy region, and he had been standing deep in that fog longer than he wanted to admit. The most frightening part was that every time Nick considered stopping, he saw again what Matt had done and the severe consequences that followed, and his anger pushed him forward. Revenge became the fuel that helped him silence guilt, even as it reshaped him into a colder version of himself. Meanwhile, Matt began to suspect, and Matt's suspicion didn't erupt into a loud confrontation. It spread like a hairline crack in glass mold at first, then impossible to unsee. He could feel the unnaturally smooth alignment between Newman and Jabbit, something that rarely happened without a hidden motive. Matt began to dig into their intentions, not by asking direct questions, but by watching the smallest tells, the timing that lined up to perfectly, the rushed attempts to cover tracks, the requests that sounded logical yet placed him exactly where he shouldn't be standing. The more he watched, the clearer the pattern became. Nick needed Matt to dirty his hands so Newman could stay clean. Jack needed Matt trapped so Jabbit could stay safe. And when Matt saw that pattern, he recognized something else of equal value. They were afraid of him. That fear handed Matt the one kind of power he craved most, the power to choose when and how to strike back. Jack and Nick were forced to face direct consequences of using Matt. Even before their plan was complete, the risks of exposure stopped being theoretical and started becoming pressure. They could feel in every step. Nick realized he had to trust Jack more than he wanted, because he couldn't manage alone. Once Matt began to change rhythm, Jack, too, understood he had pushed too far, that every subtle influence he exerted on Matt left a traces of calculation, ambition, and the truth that Jabbit would use anyone to win. And when two intelligent men find themselves staring at the possibility of being flipped by a dangerous variable, the differences between them suddenly shrink. They were no longer men in control. They were men trying to keep a box they had opened from bursting completely. In rare moments when Nick was alone, he began to ask himself what would happen if Matt truly understood he was being treated like a pawn. Would Matt explode out of insult, or become colder than ever because he had finally located their weakness? Nick realized revenge was no longer about punishing Matt. At this point, revenge had become a survival war over dignity and control. If Matt counterattacked, he wouldn't only drag Nick down, he could pull down the very structures Nick and Jack depended on to exist. That thought made Nick want the end to come quickly and also fear the end. He feared the moment everything turned unmistakably clear. Because clarity meant judgment: who was right, who was wrong, who crossed the line first, who became the very thing he once despised. Jack wasn't calm either. He could see in Nick a reckless fire disguised as composure. He understood Nick was being driven by emotion more than Nick would admit. And Jack knew that when a plan built on manipulation is powered by revenge, it slips off course more easily than anything. Jack wanted control, wanted to reduce everything to numbers and leverage. But Matt was a variable that refused to stand still. Matt was the solution and the problem, the opportunity to shift the balance and the trap that could swallow them whole. As time tightened, the tension thickened like fog. No one had to say it. Nick and Jack could feel that their safe window was closing. Matt no longer moved like a man simply following paths drawn for him. He began creating gaps that were hard to explain, silences that lingered too long, choices that made Nick and Jack wonder whether this was random drift or the early shape of a counterstrike. The more they tried to grip, the more Matt slipped away in subtler, sharper ways. And it was that subtlety that terrified them most, because it meant Matt wasn't just suspicious, Matt was preparing. By the time Nick and Jack understood they might have gone too far, the realization didn't arrive as a punch to the face. It came as a chill down the spine. They started replaying recent decisions with a new kind of dread. Fear that they had missed a tiny detail. Fear that Matt had collected enough pieces to rebuild the real picture. Fear that every secret deal would return as a noose round their own necks. Nick knew that if Matt struck, he wouldn't do it loudly. He would choose the exact moment, the exact weakness, the exact place where Nick couldn't defend himself in time. Jack knew that if Matt wanted payment, he wouldn't settle for a business loss who would turn it into a moral stain that could never be scrubbed away. The hook came as a cold sign neither of them could deny, a small shift in how Matt responded. A movement that made Nick suddenly feel as if he was no longer the one pulling strings. In that altered rhythm, Nick heard a warning without words that Matt knew, or at least knew enough to weaponize uncertainty. And when Nick went to Jack to tighten the plan one last time, they shared the same suffocating thought. They were no longer using Matt as a pawn. It was possible they themselves had become pieces being placed for the kill. At the edge of exposure, the most frightening question wasn't what Matt would do next, but whether Matt already held the most dangerous kind of power of all power to choose the moment when both Newman and Jabbett would be forced to their knees, while Nick and Jack could do nothing but wait to see exactly how he intended to make it happen. Jack Abbott didn't need anyone to remind him that Matt was an explosive variable. The moment that name surfaced in any conversation, the air around Jabbett seemed to change, as if a piece of heated metal had been dropped into cold water quiet on impact, but sending ripples that lasted far too long. Jack was used to this kind of danger, the kind that doesn't storm the front door, but slips in through the cracks of confidence and lies still until someone gets careless. So when word reached him that Nick had been secretly contacting Matt, Jack's first reaction wasn't merely irritation. It was the instinctive sense that someone had reached into the territory Jack guarded most fiercely control. Nick wasn't naive and he certainly wasn't easy to manipulate. But that was exactly why Nick's move felt so unsettling. Acting without Victor's knowledge and outside Jabbett's established strategy wasn't a simple detour. It was a signal that Nick was building a parallel fight. And parallel fights almost always left fractures that never fully healed. Jack confronted Nick in a state that was both angry and cold. He didn't need to raise his voice for the intensity to be felt. It lived in the pauses that ran a beat too long between questions, in the look that seemed to remeasure every boundary between two families, whose interests often overlapped but rarely aligned into the same true front. Jack looked at Nick the way you look at someone reaching for a bare wire in the dark. Maybe he was doing the right thing, or maybe he was about to be shocked beyond recognition before he could even cry out. What irritated Jack most wasn't that Nick had approached Matt, but that he had done it without letting Victor know, and without accounting for the blowback on Jabbett. In a war with Victor, Jack understood that danger didn't only come from the enemy's strike. It also came from disorder among the people trying to resist him. A plan without coordination could become Victor's bait with a single subtle twist. And Jack refused to let Jabbett be the one paying for Nick's gamble. But Nick didn't retreat. He explained his purpose with a hard-edged determination, as if he had spent too many nights persuading himself that this was the only path left. Nick didn't deny the risk, and he didn't deny that he was stepping outside Victor's gravitational field. But he anchored everything to the one truth that made Jack hesitate. Nick wasn't acting to topple Victor out of spite or ambition. He was acting because he could see Newman being manipulated by Victor, to the point of self-destruct, and he couldn't stand still while that happened. Nick didn't speak about winning like a slogan. He spoke about protection like a desperate form of self-defense. To Nick, Victor was no longer simply a father or a leader. Victor had become a force that pulled everyone nearby into his orbit, whether they wanted it or not. Nick wanted out of that orbit, and holding sensitive information felt like the one narrow doorway Nick could still see. Jack heard something more convincing than any vow in Nick's explanation: fear. Not fear of Matt and not fear of failure, but fear that Victor would keep rewriting the rules until men like Nick had only two options left: obedience or disappearance. Jack recognized that fear because he had stood in Victor's shadow long enough to understand how the man controlled space, controlled information, and controlled loyalty with a kind of authority built on a lifetime of victories. Jack also understood that if Nick truly could use Matt's information to carve out a zone of safety for Newman, a zone Victor couldn't react, then it wouldn't only benefit Newman. It would give Jabbett time and leverage to brace for a more volatile Victor. Because when Victor feels control slipping, he doesn't just strike harder and strikes wider. Jack's anger didn't vanish, but it shifted into a sharper form of clarity. He began to see Nick's plan not as a betrayal of order, but as a parallel track that might produce an advantage in a confrontation everyone knew would stretch on. Jack wasn't the kind of man who handed out trust easily, and he wasn't inclined to side with Newman simply because the argument sounded reasonable. Yet here he saw something rare: a shared aim. Both he and Nick were trying to avoid being defined and dictated by Victor. Jack had confronted Victor openly many times, and he knew the cost of doing it in the light. Victor always found a way to bend public perception, bend alliances, and paint the opponent as the one who started the war. Nick, by contrast, was moving in the shadows, using the very fog of information Victor loved to weaponize against him. Jack realized that sometimes the most effective route wasn't charging into the wall, but finding the small door the wall hadn't managed to seal. From that moment, a quiet alliance began to take shape, and not fueled by excitement, but by reluctant calculation. Jack agreed to help Nick conceal the deal, but it wasn't the kind of agreement that loosened anything. It was more like an unwritten contract where both men knew a single mistake could drag them down together. Jack accepted the idea of supplying resources that could be disguised as normal Jabbit activity so they wouldn't leave obvious fingerprints. He even offered a safe location for Matt to hide, because Jack understood that the more exposed Matt remained, the greater the chance he'd be seized by Victor or anyone else who wanted to control the narrative. And if Matt fell into someone else's hands, everything Nick was trying to build would become a blade turned inward. A safe place wasn't just shelter. It was a way of keeping the most dangerous variable within a range that could be watched. But Jack didn't do anything for nothing. He demanded that Nick share everything Matt provided, no withholding, no selective filtering based on emotion or Newman's convenience. Jack knew that secret alliances died faster from betrayal between allies than from the strength of the enemy. If Matt truly had leverage potent enough to make Victor wobble, then Jabbit needed to know so Jack could prepare an exit route, an advance route, and an attack route if it came to that. Jack was protecting himself the way a leader had to. He couldn't place Jabbit inside a blind risk simply because Nick believed he could handle it. Jack needed data. He needed the full picture. He needed to know exactly what Matt was saying, what Matt was holding, and what Matt intended to trade for his cooperation. Because Matt never handed out information out of goodwill, Matt always demanded a price. And that price could be the thing that shattered structures Jack had spent years building. Nick accepted Jack's terms, but the acceptance carried its own tension. Nick wanted to protect Newman from Victor, yet he also carried the instinct of a son. Some part of him still hated that he had to oppose Victor by relying on someone like Matt. Hated that he had to move in secrecy as if he were the one in the wrong. Nick understood Jack's demand for transparency, but he also knew that every piece of information he handed over reduced his control over the path he was trying to carve. Still, Nick had no better option. Alone, he would be too easy for Victor to crush. With an alliance fragile as it was, at least gained a layer of armor that might keep Victor from reading him immediately. Nick chose to comply not because he trusted Jack completely, but because Jack possessed what he needed: experience with Victor, and the ability to hide actions inside a system that was always being watched. Jack wasn't fully at ease after agreeing either. He could feel himself stepping into a gray zone he usually avoided, cooperating with Newman not because both sides would win, but because both sides might survive a Victor who was growing harder to predict. Jack found himself wondering whether he was helping Nick or helping himself. And the answer made him uncomfortable because it was too honest, was doing both. And sometimes the line between those motives was so thin that one wrong choice would make Jack look like a traitor to the very order he once used as a weapon against Victor. Yet Jack also understood that the order had been broken for a long time. Victor had twisted it to his liking. And if Jack kept clinging to proper procedure while Victor treated procedure like a toy, Jack would always be a step behind, always walking into traps late in advance. So the alliance between Jack and Nick didn't feel like victory. It felt like a locked door opened with a key that wasn't supposed to exist, possible, but loud in its own way, with hinges that creaked and forced both men to glance around as if someone might have heard. Jack began arranging resources with the precision of a man who knew the smallest trace could become evidence. Nick began adjusting his own rhythm, more careful, less exposed because every rush of impatience could put him directly in Victor's sights. They didn't need spoken reassurance to understand each other. They understood through the silences they chose at the right moments, through the gestures they avoided, through the way they moved like men crossing thin ice and refusing to be the first to hear it crack. The most dangerous part was that the tighter they coordinated, the more they were bound to each other. If Nick made a mistake, Jack would be dragged with him. If Jack miscalculated, Nick would lose his one solid support. And if Matt Leader even simply shifted his posture to serve himself, everything they were trying to build would become a weapon turned back on them. Nick saw that and kept moving anyway because he felt time shrinking. Jack saw it and grew even more cautious. Because he knew time itself was one of Victor's favorite traps. Victor waited for opponents to tire, to tangle themselves. And then he struck precisely when they believed they were safe. When their terms were finally set, Jack still couldn't fully shake the original discomfort. It was no longer irritation that Nick had gone off script. It was irritation because Jack realized Nick had touched the truth Jack didn't want to admit. Victor was most powerful not when he attacked, but when he forced others to reshape their lives around him. Nick was trying to escape that by building a parallel route. And Jack by choosing to help was admitting that the old method of confronting Victor might not be enough anymore. Jack felt himself step into a war with no name, where agreements weren't written down, where loyalty was measured by how far someone dared to conceal the truth for you, and where every margin of error could cost reputation, power, or the future of an entire company. The end of the moment didn't arrive as a neat conclusion, but as the sense that everything had been placed into position to wait for whatever came next. Nick left Jack feeling slightly lighter but not remotely calm, as if he had gained an ally and also bound himself to a new rope. Jack remained behind with thoughts he couldn't fully organize, wondering whether he had opened a strategic door or released a knife into his own room. The secret alliance had formed, but it didn't feel like a foundation. It felt like a temporary bridge over a deep drop strong enough to take one careful step at a time, but too fragile for anyone to run. And somewhere in that shared silence, a question lingered that neither man spoke aloud. If Victor caught the scent of this parallel path, would he smash the bridge with a direct blow? Or would he quietly change the ground beneath their feet until the moment they looked down and realized they had walked too far from the shore of safety? On our TV Spoilers channel, I'm always looking for content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.